WJXT Studios. This Week in Jacksonville starts right now.
And the FBI has now taken the lead investigating the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. Speaking yesterday at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania, he said in a social media post that he was shot with a bullet that pierced the upper part of his right ear. The presidential candidate's campaign assures the public Donald Trump is fine, but the perspective from the crowd's point of view was chaos. Listen in.
And look what happened to our country. Probably 20 million people. And you know, that's a little bit... He's going down!
And then a lot of screaming and running and fear, no one knowing what was happening in those moments. And President Joe Biden spoke after the shooting, saying there's no place in America for this kind of violence.
But the bottom line is that the Trump rally was a rally that he should have been able to be conducted peacefully without any problem. But the idea that there's political violence or violence in America like this is just unheard of. It's just not appropriate. And everybody must condemn it.
Secret Service killed the shooter at the scene, and overnight, the FBI identified 20-year-old Matthew Crooks as the gunman. He was from Bethel Park, Pennsylvania. That's about 35 miles from the rally in Butler. Authorities said at a news conference they don't believe there are any additional existing threats, but as the investigation continues, the FBI is urging anyone with information, pictures, video, to submit to fbi.gov/Butler. The shooting left one attendee dead. 2 others have been critically injured. Authorities say all 3 are adult men. So good morning to each of you. We're bringing you this special live edition of This Week in Jacksonville as the local community and the world community try to grasp an assassination attempt against Donald Trump. A shocking event just days before the start of the Republican National Convention. And I'm joined this morning by Rick Mullaney and Chris Hand, and appreciate your expertise and insights as we talk through political issues here. Rick, you just joined us on the morning show. Why don't you give us your reaction to this stunning event yesterday?
You know, Ken, I don't know if I have the right words for it. It was horrific. It was stunning. It was shocking. But you know, Wall Street Journal talked this morning about that, saying as shocking as it was, in some ways, maybe it wasn't, in the sense that our political rhetoric, the public discourse, the divide in this country has been so severe that some felt that we're heading down this path. And one positive that potentially comes out of this is this is an inflection point for a conversation for Republicans and Democrats, for the entire country about the direction we're heading. I think President Obama spoke to this in a call for more civility, but it's not just about civility. It's about the nature of the way we're conducting our politics and the way we're heading forward as a country. So it was horrific and stunning. And really, when you see an attendee dying, when you see 2 in critical condition, and when you see that for former President Trump, we are 1 inch away from changing the course of American history yesterday. That's how close it was. Truly stunning, but potentially an inflection point.
Yeah, Chris, your reaction to this?
Well, just an awful day, and of course, awful for the human toll that was taken. Obviously, our thoughts and prayers with President Trump and also with the families of those who were killed or, as Rick said, critically injured at the rally yesterday. But beyond the human toll, also the toll on our democracy. Political violence always tears at the fabric of our democracy, no matter what form it takes. And of course, yesterday it took the form of a rally where people were peaceably assembled, as they are allowed to under the First Amendment in this country. Political violence affecting that rally, as Rick said, coming very close to assassinating a former and potentially future president of the United States, and also tearing again at our sense of safety in the democratic process. So it is really important at this moment that we learn how to talk about politics differently. I think it's incumbent on everybody involved in the political process to analyze how they're discussing it, but also for us to learn how to talk not just about politics or at each other, but also to each other again, and try and restore a productive, civil, healthy dialogue in our political system.
Yeah, even that notion, instead of talking to, how about speaking with? Making it a conversation, making it a little bit more collaborative exchange of ideas rather than that pointed narrative that can come out sometimes. I want to show you, again, we're bringing you up to date on some of the things that have happened in the last 24 hours, but this is video from last night Donald Trump walking off his plane in New Jersey after the assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. Really stunning to see what happened in that rally. And then as the camera pulled out and you saw the Secret Service members, wow, powerful images of those Secret Service agents wrapping their bodies around the former president to protect him. It's really something. We're going to share more perspective here, but as we go through this morning, a lot of conversation about how someone was able to do this, and a former Secret Service agent sharing his perspective after seeing what happened.
There was a lapse in security somewhere. I think it's evident to all of us. And we just don't know how that occurred. And as somebody who's flown around in helicopters around Washington, D.C. and looking for snipers on rooftops myself, did that for quite a while. That's what you're looking for, and making sure that those doors that go up to rooftops are secure and they're checked and double checked, and there's somebody there who prevents somebody else from going out there after you check it. But unfortunately with this certain event, I'm not sure how it occurred. Obviously, from watching the video, it sounded like they got 8 shots off, and the 9th shot sounded different than the rest, and I just surmised that was a counter sniper shooting back, from reporting in the media that the shooter was taken down.
In Florida, Senator Rick Scott demanding a hearing to get answers. He says in a statement released late last night, the assassination attempt on President Trump and murder of an innocent American demands immediate answers from the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Secret Service. It is a miracle that President Trump is alive and well, but absolutely inexcusable that the deranged would-be assassin had a direct line of sight to the former president and the leading candidate for president of the United States. So Chris and Rick, Senator Scott saying he wants the Senate committee that has oversight of DHS and Secret Service to immediately start investigating, wants a hearing before August just to make sure that this never happens again. We can talk later about some of the history in our nation with this violence, but what's your view on the Secret Service response and the call here for an investigation?
Well, I think there should be a full and very robust investigation of what happened there. Obviously, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has taken over the overall kind of law enforcement piece of this. They'll be investigating. I'm sure the United States Secret Service will be investigating. And it's also very appropriate for Congress to exercise its oversight role and investigate this particular situation as well. Very concerning, the political violence that occurred that, came very close to costing the life of a former president. So there should be an investigation from as many possible perspectives as possible so the American public knows as fast as possible exactly what happened at Butler.
Yeah, Rick, what do you think about this? And you've been a prosecutor, you've seen, we need to get to that point, Senator Scott's point, we can't let this happen again.
Clearly so. A couple points. Number one big question, of course, is how did this shooter from 130 yards away, have a direct line in with this shot on the rooftop? And what was this, how did that possibly happen? Now, there's heightened security for the president, and there's some security, significant security for a former president, but not as much. And that'll be discussed in the days ahead. That's one really big question. How did this possibly happen? Second big question is the shooter. His background, his history, his motivation. That's going to be highly scrutinized. But for the future, I think you're going to take a look at this overall, what has happened here, and ask, what are we going to do with the RNC starting tomorrow, with future rallies? What is going to be the security level, and how are we going to handle this in the future?
Yeah, so Rick pointed this out. We'll kind of wrap up our segment here, but former President Barack Obama issued a statement and said there's absolutely no place for political violence in our democracy. Although we don't yet know exactly what happened, we should all be relieved that former President Trump wasn't seriously hurt, and use this moment to recommit ourselves to civility and respect in our politics. Michelle and I are wishing him a quick recovery. So when we come back, the impact on the country, the democratic process, the presidential campaigns. Stay with us. That's next on this live edition of This Week in Jacksonville.
This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And we're taking a live look at the White House on this Sunday morning. The White House certainly in view there because the President of the United States, speaking about the former President of the United States, nearly being assassinated last night. Thanks for joining us today. Rick Mullaney and Chris Hand are here with us as we talk through this. And Rick, if you would start us in this segment, let's just talk about the impact on our nation. The world is watching. Maybe later we'll show you some of the comments that are coming in from other world leaders. But this is absolutely having an effect on United States of America.
Well, a couple things. Let's talk near term and long term. Near term, the Republican National Convention starts tomorrow. And one obvious question is, how is it going to affect it? And you hate to talk in just pure political terms, but there's an enormous opportunity here for President Trump and the Trump campaign to try to not only unite the Republican Party, but to unite the entire nation. If Trump is up for this as a leader, calling for unity, and handles this in the right way, I think this could be a very big moment for him. There is a natural rallying around someone who is the victim of this type of an assassination attempt, as there was for Reagan in 1981, when he got a big political advantage out of that. So in the RNC, I expect there to be this attempt to unite everyone. I also expect there to be this attempt to rally everyone, and I expect them to want to define Donald Trump, consistent with some of the imagery you saw, is that he is resilient, that he's a fighter, and he's with you, but he's also got to make this, I think, more about the future and uniting the entire country. So in the near term, he has that opportunity. Longer term, I am very hopeful, but not necessarily optimistic, that this will be an inflection point in which we take a hard look at our politics and take a hard look at the direction we're heading. We've been talking on this program for a long time about the worst partisan divide of our lifetime and how unhealthy it is and the direction that we're heading. And I hope that yesterday will be a bit of a very significant point in which there's serious reflection on both sides of the aisle about the nature of our politics and how we're running campaigns. And I do expect it to have an impact over the next 115 to 120 days up to Election Day on how we go about conducting this campaign, and maybe, hopefully, in a more constructive way. We can disagree on policies, we can disagree on direction, but the personal attacks and the Armageddon-type scenarios of electing one side or the other, I think some of that rhetoric is going to have to be rethought, and I think you're going to have a different kind of politics, long-term and near-term.
Chris, we talk so often about the engagement of the citizenry and being part of this, but something like this happens, it can have a chilling effect. It can make people say, yikes, I don't want to be involved at all.
Well, imagine being someone who was at that rally yesterday, who had, again, peaceably assembled as the First Amendment specifically authorized, and have that sort of violence occur. I think it is a moment where we all have to take stock as citizens and remember that we as citizens have that most crucial role in the process and can't let that shooter dissuade us from engaging the process. But as we think about the system as a whole, Kent, I think this is probably going to be the most consequential summer in American political history since one that occurred 55 years ago in 1968. If you see what's happened just over the last 24 hours, there's been an assassination attempt on a former president of the United States. Obviously now the Republican National Convention is going to nominate him and a running mate to be their standard bearers in the fall. A month from now, the Democrats are going to gather in Chicago, which is where also the 1968 Democratic National Convention was held, with a lot of uncertainty there as to who the Democratic nominee for president is going to be. Is that going to be President Biden, or is the party going to nominate somebody else? So it really has the potential to be a very consequential summer. How we as citizens handle it, how elected officials and candidates handle it, will really have a huge impact on the future of American politics.
Yeah, and for both of you, how does this affect? We've got a live picture there from Milwaukee and where the Republican National Convention is going to be. How is this going to affect what Republicans do at this conference?
Well, a couple things. One, I'd like to go back to Chris's point about how consequential it is. I certainly agree. But if you step back, this is so historic and unprecedented. It's incredible, really. We are living American history right now. The challenges that President Biden's facing are unlike any that I recall in my lifetime. I've never seen anything quite like it. His debate obviously did not go well, to put it mildly. Now there are calls within his own party, of course, for him not to be the nominee. Donald Trump has always been controversial. Now you've had this assassination attempt. You have the two oldest candidates in history. We are witnessing something that will be talked about, I think, for generations to come. Some of that you'll see, in answer to your question, you will see play out in the Republican convention this week, a discussion of those things. They'll want to contrast President Trump with Joe Biden. I hope they do it in a way that is constructive and makes sense for the future. But I think all of us should be self-aware that we are living through something right now that is historic and nothing like any of us have ever experienced. I do remember 1968, of course, when Bobby Kennedy was killed. 1968 was one of those great consequential and historic years. I think this summer, as Chris rightfully points out, we are living through something that we've never seen before, and it is unlike anything we've ever seen, really.
Yeah, Chris, final word before we go to a commercial break.
Well, I just think it's incumbent. I think we don't want to lose sight. It's easy when you see these big events to think that has nothing to do with me. I think it's incumbent on everybody, given that critical role we have as citizens, to realize it's not just incumbent on the candidates or the elected officials to define how they're going to react to this. All of us as citizens have an obligation, and this would be the worst possible moment to stop engaging as citizens. We need to engage peaceably, respectfully, but continue to show up and be part of the process. That is what helps to heal and repair a tear in democracy like yesterday's shooting caused.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So when we come back, we're going to discuss the history of our country, past assassinations and attempts. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
World leaders are reacting to the assassination attempt on President Trump. A spokesperson for China's president said China is concerned about the shooting of former President Trump. President Xi Jinping has expressed condolences and sympathies to former President Trump. And French President Emmanuel Macron said, "My thoughts are with President Donald Trump, the victim of an assassination attempt. I send him my wishes for a speedy recovery. A spectator has died, several are injured. It is a tragedy for our democracies. France shares the shock and indignation of the American people." Chris Hand, Rick Mullaney with us. I think we're feeling some of that shock and indignation this morning. And part of this goes back to, and in this segment, I just wanted to kind of wrap up our conversation. America has a history of this. We just referenced 1968, but even before that, when we look at this, there have been past assassination attempts. More recently, Steve Scalise, 2017, Gabby Giffords, President Reagan. Before that, it was Gerald Ford, George Wallace, Robert F. Kennedy. All of these things are part of American history. It is tough to look at that list, and even tougher still to know that in 2024 we're dealing with this again.
Well, it certainly is, Kent, and particularly in sort of recent years when members of Congress, as you say, Gabrielle Giffords in 2011 was shot at a sort of public gathering where, with other people injured or killed there. Steve Scalise was practicing for the congressional softball game and was shot. So it's very concerning to see this invasion of violence into the political system whenever it occurs. And each of these events, all the ones you just named and listed on the screen, have a jarring effect on the country, on our own view of our own safety, on our view of kind of discourse in a political campaign, on our view of kind of what politics is and how it's going to evolve. This one is one of the most jarring of all, of course, because like with President Reagan in 1981, like with President Ford in 1975, like with John F. Kennedy in 1963 and others beforehand, it involves a former president, making it even more of an attack, not just on the person, but on the institution and our political system.
Yeah, Rick?
Well, you had those quotes earlier from China and from France, and you've seen them from Democrats and Republicans. We have a small window here in which there's one thing where everyone's unified on, and that is the condemnation of this assassination. And of course, the tragic death of the attendee and the two that are seriously injured. The real question is where to from here? And we've been talking about that, where to from here? This is sort of a small thing in one way, but maybe not. When President Trump and Joe Biden came out for their debate, the two men did not shake hands. Obvious disdain the two men have for each other, and you can see that in the debate. Last night, they spoke on the phone briefly. Symbolically, I think it's important. We were talking during the break. I said, maybe this change in the environment doesn't start in the Oval Office. Maybe it starts at the kitchen table. Maybe it begins with a change in conversation on public discourse about how we have disagreements over increasing taxes or decreasing taxes, or supporting Ukraine or not supporting Ukraine, or how we're going to address immigration, how we're not, as opposed to what it's become. My fear, my concern is directionally where we've been heading for a long time is one in which this is a concern on the right and the left. And I hope there's going to be a period of reflection on the right and the left about where we are and how we get there. Now, let's face it, it's about winning on both sides. It's about it's about power and success. And so that gravity will take you back to the old politics. But I do think it's so jarring what happened yesterday. It's so serious what happened yesterday that maybe this does become that inflection point where we can begin to maybe tilt our politics in a different direction.
Yeah. Our colleague John Newman, who joins us for discussions of political events and election coverage and whatever, last night he was on our newscast at 10, and he said, words matter. And I think that's what so many people are saying right now. How we talk about the other side, how we talk about these issues, how we talk to each other is really, really important. So a final 30 seconds for each of you before we wrap up.
I would just say, and in keeping with John's comments last night, what you just said, I think all of us have a little personal assignment after this, which is next time we engage with someone with a differing point of view, or maybe even to proactively reach out to someone we know and have a differing point of view, and let's practice exactly what Rick talked about at the kitchen table, speaking differently, respecting other points of view, trying to understand other viewpoints. I think this event is an opportunity for all of us to make that change.
Yeah, I don't want to cut you off, but 30 seconds or less.
Very briefly, words do matter.
Yeah.
And action matters. So the action that follows those words, what we're going to say and how we're going to treat people, this very serious, horrific event potentially could be a bit of a turning point to take us, I hope, in a much more constructive direction.
I hope. Rick Mullaney, Chris Hand, thank you so much for your time. A reminder that we'll be covering the Republican National Convention. Our reporter Scott Johnson will be there in Milwaukee starting this evening with his coverage. We thank you so much for joining us on this live edition of This Week in Jacksonville.
See why every day more people are choosing News 4 Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.